An apartment, an apartment. I must have it, an apartment, an apartment, an apartment. I'm sick from sleeping in the park. I'll take a small room, I'll take a whole room. I will even take a ballroom. My toothbrush and my comb and myself ain't got a home. Oh please, somebody charge me rent.
I'm George Gingell. This is About Buildings and Cities.
I'm Luke Jones.
This is Corbu Part 7. I think we're going to have a little break after this episode.
Yeah.
For a couple. And then we're going to try and finish off Season 1 of Corb.
Yeah.
Which was planned to be 3 episodes. And I think will be 10.
We're going to get as far as the 1930s, I think.
Yeah, and then I think we'll have a long break.
But there's an awful lot to talk about. In a way, what we're discussing today follows on quite neatly from our rather overlong, or not overlong, but rather unexpectedly long exploration of urbanism.
Hey, we talk when we're on the roll.
It just goes on and
you
on.
You didn't hear all of the when it turns to edited out content.
Gosh, yeah.
We tried to record that one about 3 times.
Yeah, we took out a lot.
There was a lot of literally unbroadcastable content.
Yeah, that can go in the archive. So it's worth recalling that the many elements of Charles-Édouard Jeanneret's developing architectural programme, the power of new technology, new approaches to urban form, a purified, somewhat austere domesticity, and all underpinned by a recentering of the role of the architect as an artistic and creative leader, first resolved themselves in this theoretical project for mass housing, the Maison Domino, back in 1914, which we discussed at the end of episode 1, I think, of Corbu. But as the 1920s progressed, opportunities to explore mass housing as a type started to arise. These projects, a selection of which we're going to examine in this episode, they form a sort of link between the intimacy of the villas and the megalomaniacal scale of urbanism. I guess that's debatable.
Sometimes they do. Could I just say a little bit about social housing in general? He's right about the great city, industrialisation, earlier in Britain, but in the late 19th century in continental Europe, brings about very big cities very quickly. Also huge employers, and the conditions in those cities are very bad. Various people make attempts to improve the conditions of those housing industrial workers. And you have in different countries different strains. So in Britain, what's the famous mill called? I've forgotten the name.
Oh, New Lanark.
New Lanark, or Bourneville, or things like that. So you've got sort of...
So that's the kind of enlightened capitalist.
Normally non-conformist Christian. It's sort of benign paternalism.
Yeah, so they normally try and stop them drinking as well, you know.
Oh yeah, it's like the have you read the rules for living on one of the Guinness estates? Or you have to go to church 3 times a week, and you must spy on your neighbours, and you've got to do a certain amount of keeping the collective gardens.
And some of them are more, they're more or less avowedly socialist. Robert Owen sort of is. He's kind of in the pantheon of like early socialist heroes.
There's that strain. Big industrialists in France and Germany also built housing for their workers in different sort of models. I guess there's garden cities are a part of that. And then in the run up to the First World War, you get progressive local authorities setting up housing associations in Central Europe, so in German-speaking countries. You get Siedlung movement, which just I think means basically estates. There's like Karl-Marx-Hof, that's a bit later.
Yeah, that's in the 20s in
that's
Vienna.
In the 20s. So, but I mean, they are actually building kind of garden city things at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
There's one just up the road from here.
Coming out of the Great Exhibition, even, some of them are built as one of the kind of minor hobby horses of Prince Albert.
Up until the run up to the First World War, they're essentially either drawing from garden city or historicist norms. And they tend to be, in the centres of cities, big historicist buildings like the sort of flats that you build for bourgeois people, which are like palace things that are meant to look like palaces but are actually lots of flats.
Mansion blocks.
They're either in imitation of mansion blocks, or if they're in smaller settlements or on the outside, they're like high-density cottages. And so that's the state of the art up till like 1910 or something like that, the people who were doing them weren't necessarily going to be formally innovative. It isn't necessary that this new thing of subsidised housing, which is essentially what it is, needs a different sort of style. So the assumption that comes in later, that actually there'll be a stylistic difference, I think it's good to just start without that. Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling thing, but I think it's good to set some...
It's a useful digression, and I think also it sets up this other kind of innate subtext to all these. Certainly social housing projects always have a normative undertone. They are very rarely purely about material assistance. They are almost always also about kind of steering that potentially sort of reckless poor towards a more virtuous and respectable path. So the degree to which that is foregrounded is very, very variable. You know, in Arnold Circus, which is down the road from here, you know, it's very deliberate what they didn't put in. The boundary of the home is very, very tightly circumscribed. And the communal space, well, it's now become rather sort of beautifully untidy, the communal space, but you can see that it was designed to be extremely kind of normatively manicured. You know, there's
it's
like a bandstand.
It's meant to be respectable.
Yeah.
It's meant to promote respectability. It's always a political act, for sort of certainly a definition of politics, to do this. So it will always be politically loaded because it's not being done commercially. In Germany, there's sort of benign state capitalism, which is like, well, we've got to look after the proles a bit, otherwise they'll get uppity, in a kind of Bismarckian grab the skirt of history as it goes by. So, and they are just extremely utilitarian, which is what was happening a lot. That's the other. So, you know, in Berlin, before any of the Korb things, just before, there's Bruno Taut's big horseshoe ring, but next to that is the one done by the right-wing housing association, and it's the most utilitarian 7-storey blocks with pitched roofs, rendered gross to net minimum cost to provide units. So you can do that as well.
Well, that's all bubbling under the surface, isn't it? Should we start talking about a project and then see how some of this plays out? There's a couple of things to point out about how these projects differ from the ones which we've explored in urbanism. Very obviously, they have to compromise with existing site conditions and also with existing material and procurement conditions. There's also, obviously, a bit of a continuum. Things are evolving as we go on through them and being tested and often, as you might expect, found wanting in various ways. So the first project that we want to talk about is Pessac, which, and this is pretty early, at least in its initiation. He got the job in 1923. He's working for an industrialist called Henri Frugès, who was a sugar magnate around Bordeaux, and he's probably, we kind of said this already, we haven't done any research on it, but he's probably also responsible for some of these strange commissions like the water tower that he was doing in the area at the same time. It would be very surprising if he wasn't. And this very much fits into the same sort of tradition as Bourneville, which we mentioned already, in the sense that he's got a factory, he's got lots of workers, and he wants to build a sort of modern and commodious city quarter, as it were, for his workers, although in practice it's actually pretty far out of the city.
There is a difference as well, though, which is that he is someone who regarded himself as culturally sophisticated, possibly even slightly culturally avant-garde. He was an amateur architect himself, and a painter, I think, as well.
According to the biography, not only a painter, but also a sculptor, writer, pianist and composer, and architect, yeah.
I'm afraid we haven't been able to get any of his works for you.
I bet it's great.
I think a little piano recording would be a real
That'd be great.
addition.
Well, let's see if I can find anything.
If anyone has got any piano recordings by
Henri Frugès, yeah.
This is meant to be model, not only as a model settlement, but also it's meant to be model, progressive, avant-garde architecture. And it's meant to show not only that the modern housing is better, but that it can be more rationally made and cheap and wonderful. and better in every way. This is the usual promise made by progressive architects. It's going to be functionally more rational, and by getting, blowing away the fusty old traditions of the past, it's going to be better, cheaper, more commodious, and more flexible.
It's awarded in 23. I think it starts on site in 25. Rather tellingly, in the complete works published in 1929, the photos are still of the project on site, and it started to encounter problems pretty early on because of its method of construction. So I think that Corbusier really saw this as an opportunity to deploy the domino system in a real-world context, albeit that he had developed it a little bit from the form that it had been exhibited in 1914 or in the early 20s.
Do you have any of the semi-built construction pictures?
So we've got one photo here. Most of them are not... So the ones in the earth make it look like it's done, but there are just piles of earth everywhere. This one, you can see one where it's being built here, where you can see there are some prefabricated elements which have been laid out, and you can also see the frame which is in the process of being cast.
Is it a post frame with cinder block infill, and then the slab build-up is like cinder blocks with lintel beams?
It's got these little precast sort of flat arch concrete elements, which I think are laid into the frame. You can see the picture here. Should we talk about the design?
Yeah. I think at some point we should talk about his... Okay, yeah. Aren't they reusable formwork, maybe?
Well, then I think maybe the caption is wrong. Yeah. They do look sort of formworky, don't they? They look too thin.
It's meant to be reusable formwork, is meant to be or maybe they're formwork that stays in position. Oh, so this is yet another bloody constructional system. I mean, he's already uses... There's a few slightly different ways in which he does his build-ups, which are all similar to, but not quite... They haven't quite got to the way that we do it now.
Should we talk about the kind of innovations on the domino system and
sure,
as they appear in here? So there's a couple of types. The one which is most often photographed are these ones which are rather charmingly referred to as skyscrapers, which are actually 4-story tall little... they're essentially semi-detached houses.
Yeah, I think they're 4 stories, but the top story is entirely open.
Yeah, the top story is a garden. I mean, the plan is pretty sort of pragmatic, isn't it? It's got so they're 2 little rectangular dwellings, each of which is 3 stories with a sun terrace on top, and then the plan has got the stair sort of moved a little bit into the middle of the plan so that you create a larger area on one side and then a sort of smaller area which is normally divided into a couple of rooms, like a bathroom and a bedroom, or there's one where it's a garage, or there's one where it's another bedroom and ensuite. The big move that he's making is that he's putting a sun terrace on the top of the house, and then also there is this sculptural staircase which pops out of the side of it and which runs from the second floor up to the sun terrace. What does it actually connect to? Which room does it connect to? It's rather peculiar because it actually connects to a bedroom. Before we go into the thoughts, we could just talk about the other type, which is also on site, which is...
I think they're all the same, but they're mirrored. So if you imagine something which is 2 stories tall, where the top story extends to 2/3 of the length, and the last third is the sun terrace, and then they're flipped, so that's sort of twice as long as it's wide, and then you've got a row of them, and they're alternating, so that you get this zipper effect of terraces.
I mean, one of the things about the decisions which are made here, which is sort of peculiar, is that, in practice, this development is way out on the edge of town, and they have pretty ample gardens. It's quite, it's full of trees, it's quite a leafy site, but he nevertheless also still prioritizes making these big sun terraces up on top of the buildings, which feels like a much more urban decision.
Also, he's trying to make the ground floor uninhabited. There were meant to be, at the start of construction, he'd gone through lots and lots of ideas. At the start of construction, there were meant to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of houses on this site. Only 2 types were built because the construction turned out to be such a shambles. I mean, it's a slight warning, isn't it, that you're meant to be doing volume housing, and this is an estate with... I don't know how many units, 50 or something. in its proposed thing, and within those 50 units there are 5 completely different.
Yeah, I mean, the promise of the domino system is meant to be that because the system is so simple and it has all this reusable formwork, that you can do essentially limitless minor variations on it, but without really increasing the overall complexity very much. I think that the problem started with actually using reinforced concrete in this way at all, and with the idea of doing reusable formwork, so that they started off working with a local firm of builders who absolutely rebelled. They said that what they were being asked to do was preposterous. They were completely unable to get on with it. They then had to import another crew of builders from Paris, but even so, the progress of the build was very, very slow.
It's not that nowhere in the world economic volume reinforced concrete frame construction was going on. It was in houses. Bruno Taut's already built his horseshoe ring. That's concrete frame with cinder block and brick infill. It was slightly more expensive than the minimum, but it was much, much cheaper than this. So it may be that he was out in the sticks, but it also may be that he was being too, didactic.
He may also have been trying to do details which were too hard. I mean, you observed in the Maison La Roche his fondness for the 40 mil thick reinforced concrete wall, which is not an easy.
I went back to La Roche, went to Paris, and I looked around it, and that one is mainly all concrete. As in, the walls, floors are all just concrete, and all the shelves, the bookshelves are all continuous. I think even one pour concrete, which is mad. And the details. Now, it may be that some of the external walls have got cinder block infills. They're a bit thicker, but none of them are thick. None of them are more than 150 mil. And the build-up, I think, there was, for an internal partition, was probably 40 mil concrete with skim. And for certainly some of the exterior walls, it's 80 or 90 mil concrete with skim, plaster skim. And firstly, that's a terrible build-up for construction because the paint comes off immediately. Because the dew point is basically on the inside of the wall, and the wall is, it's just a terrible. What they've done in lots of places is where there's a window, they drill holes underneath it so that the water coming off the window could pool on the window ledge and then go out of a hole to the outside on the underneath of the inside of the window.
Mm-hmm.
That's really difficult to do and really unnecessary. Things to say about these is that these blocks are really architecturally expressive. In the skyscraper type block, on the thin end, you have a large rectangular door, the size of a garage door, and then 2 windows that span the entire width of the inside of the space, so that you just have these very thin lines on either side at 2 floors, and it looks very striking, which is a deeply unutilitarian decision. Its precision. The window is ceased to be an object window and is now an element.
It looks like a car or something. Very thin posts and then essentially windows going all the way across. It really has this sort of machine quality.
Are they steel lintels that run across? I think it's steel. I think it's a rolled steel joists that run across the whole length, and then steel windows. This is all really high spec, basically. It's not cheap to achieve that now, and it's done to create really visually interesting facades, which kind of go with his notions of proportion, as well as the gross to net being terrible because of all of the in a 4-story building, 2 of the stories aren't really inhabited.
Yeah, there's a real sense of sculpture about it. These from one side, the partial roof on the sun terrace really feels like it's kind of pushing off because the balcony is cut away below it, and you have these articulated columns which seem to be lifting it up.
There are all sorts of extraordinary. I think there's a sort of notch in the plan on the front facade, which means that the terrace is sort of 5% wider than the building on one side, so that it just steps out. And there's all these things which are like motifs from industrial architecture. That's sort of like where you might suspend a gantry crane or, a little notch, but are then stark visual cues, notionally supported, I think, by some sort of design aesthetic. All of this makes these... I've been going through different housing developments of the period by other members of the avant-garde. These are some of the best-looking... These are the best-looking ones. And the decisions made to make them look really cool and really striking and really modern, the reason other people didn't do that sort of thing is because it made them deeply expensive and impractical. Sure, he's notionally using fairly simple materials, although not super simple, but he's doing it in the high... He's doing it really Swiss, isn't he? He's gone full Swiss.
Yes.
This is so Swiss.
Yeah, like super austere, incredibly expensive.
Super austere, like super tight tolerances. You're getting some provincial builders to try and use some reusable, super precise formwork. It's actually... You have to be pretty precise to fit all these steel. Everything's really tight.
Yeah.
Everything has tiny, tiny... sharp arrises, tiny window supports, tiny tolerances. Everything goes up to the wall. Everything is flush.
In the houses themselves, so we've been sent... I should say thank you for this. We've been sent some lovely contemporary photos of them by good friend of the podcast, Jerome Flinders. I should say, good friend of the podcast and habitual Bath listener.
We love all our Bath listeners.
Which are full of him and his equally handsome brother Mikkel, sort of staring smoulderingly at various details. But there's a really nice sense of the domestic playing off the kind of machine age in them. They all have these little stoves with a very sculptural expressed chimney sitting in the middle of the plan. They're very cosy in its own way as well.
But it is closer to Zumta than it is to like volume housing, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I think that there's also that innate problem of when you're trying to do the machine age, you can't jump straight towards building architecture like you build machines on a production line, can you?
Well, certainly not if you're building 4 units.
Yeah, because you're trying to... because buildings are prototypes. Buildings are all have the difficulty and expense of...
To make a production line work, you have to have lots of units going through it. I think if you were going to build 10,000 units across a country in lots of different conditions, and you had one big team, and you had a factory, by the time you'd done 3,000 units, I think they'd get quite efficient. The first 3,000, and like after 10,000 units or something, they'd probably be like as cost effective as not doing the exercise at all. Overall, and then after then it would be good. And that's... In a way, that's what happened after the war, right? They were building so many concrete frame buildings that by the end, they were getting quite good at them. And they were getting quite cost effective. And then as soon as you stop doing it, it goes away because you've got to have contractors who are used to solving all the problems, doing loads of this. You've got to have factories that are churning out at real volumes. Then you've got the human element that can solve the problems. Problems arise. But they've seen the problem before. They know how to solve it. There's a workaround. But that he didn't really have any of the elements of that. And it meant that it was just financially ruinous, this estate. And was never finished because it was becoming so expensive.
Yeah, so the construction problems were obviously part of it. They did get it built, but as it got built...
Well, he got a little bit of it built.
Yeah. As that was going on, it also emerged... I sort of wonder if maybe Frugès thought that his architect was going to take care of all of the building permits and these sorts of things, because he certainly wasn't. And they ended up in dispute with the city. They hadn't really built a lot of the key infrastructure.
The key infrastructure is things like the road.
Yeah.
The road between the houses.
They ended up kind of marooned on the edge of town without sort of proper roads, proper services. I think we're going to move on from it in a second. So I should say that that the estate also becomes one of these didactic examples of the supposed failure of the international style in Charles Jenks's language of postmodernism, because one of the things which a lot of people who subsequently bought the houses did, or at least one of them did, which is what you see in the photo, is add these little like pitched roofs on the front and various other things. I think partly probably to try and deal with the previously noted technical limitations of some of the flat roof technology at the time.
Hello, Mrs. You are the landlady? Yes, mister. Excuse my looking like this. I got very bad insomnia. Very bad insomnia. That's all right, Mrs. You'll sleep it off. You'll feel better. Thank you. What can I do for you? My name is Label Lapzedekel Zalashitz. No, I'll come to the point. I pass your house every day at least 3 times. Thank you very much, mister. Pardon me for asking. You talk like a southerner. You come from the south? No, Mrs. I was born in Scotland. My father was born in Galicia. And my mother was born in Australia. It's wonderful how you all got together. Thank you. No, I'll come to the point. You know, mister, you look very familiar to me. I'm sure I met you somewhere. I was never there. No, I'll come to the point. Tell me, mister, at present you are working? No, I just quit. I worked in a drugstore. You poisoned somebody? No, I made the chicken salad too salty. No, I'll come to the point. Oi, mister, excuse me. I hear my son calling me. He just got out of the army. That's nice. The army gave him a commission? No, he worked for a straight salary. No, I'll come to the point. Mister, maybe you'll do me a favor? If I can, why not? My son just got married. A very nice girl. If you know somebody that's got an apartment for them, I'll be so happy you don't. Hey, mister, wait a minute. Mister, where are you running? Mister, come back! How do you like that? Today's friend is tomorrow's enemy. Bomber! Loafer! Stinker!
I think it'd be good to go on to the Weissenhofseidlung, or Werkbundsiedlung, or whatever, or the White House estate.
So this is actually, for those of you who haven't ventured deep into the back catalogue, we have referred in passing to this estate before in our Bruno Taut episodes, where it was instigated by this organisation. Is it the Deutsche Werkbund? Deutsche Werkbund, yeah.
But it gets its own organisation, and they do one every year until 1933 in German-speaking countries.
So they'd done a big one in 1914, which was this great big trade show with lots of interesting buildings, including one by Taut. And then in 1925, they did another one where they decided to take a different approach, which was to build.
It's a bit different. So they had, before the war, they'd had a series of exhibitions, which are in the style of expos, you know. They are industrial products with pavilions, and you go and see them. After the war, there was a new institution set up to promote public housing. Through a series of workbunds, they created public housing of the future exhibitions, which I think are not the same. And they have their own, and they do a series of public housing exhibitions, and this is the first of those.
Yeah, as you say, the concept is that it's a demonstration of new housing and new mass housing. Although the exhibition itself comprises only 33 houses and 63 apartments, it's very much meant to be this exemplary series of prototypical examples of how the housing crisis, which was a big sort of topic of discussion at the time, how that can be solved. And I think we could talk a little bit about the contemporary context before we go into this, because it's something where there are lots of different things going on and there are lots of different tendencies. Or do you want to talk about the building first and then go into the other people?
We could talk about what the... can I just say a little bit more about the thing? Mies van der Rohe was put in charge, and he manages to get a pretty good all-star cast of Central European architects together, of the avant-garde. And it's in Stuttgart, in suburban Stuttgart. Yeah, and they build an estate on this slight slope. And it's got a series of blocks of flats, terrace houses, and sort of mini villas. We've probably been through the people who are in it before, but we can do it again. So we've got the old guard, Mies van der Rohe, Behrens does a big block at one end. Mark Stam, how do you pronounce his name?
Mark Stam, he's a young one. I mean, Bruno and Max Taut are kind of old.
They're kind of established. They've already done big housing blocks. And then younger guys... Oh, Polzig.
Polzig is, older generation. And then there are younger ones like Mark Stam, Hans Scharoun.
Oud from the Netherlands, functionalist, Dutch, very austere Dutch architect. Gropius is there. A lot of these people just do houses which were all blown up in the war. Most of the houses were destroyed and the blocks remained, although a lot of them had like pitched tiled roofs put on them, which were then taken off in like the 90s.
Yes, they're disguised as proper architecture.
I think it's just because they'd done bituminous felt roofs, and if you walk on bituminous felt roofs, the water goes straight through them. Anyway, and it's an impressive thing, and something strange happens. I don't know if this is me marshalling them all together or something, but they all make the same sort of white box, and you can see each of the architect's particular styles coming out of, being expressed out of in their particular designs, but they're all white rendered, they all have flat roofs and are all sort of minimal, there's no extra stuff. And so you get a whole load of these, and it's a funny thing where these different people who've been working on different things come together at this point and then go off in different directions as well.
Yeah, the kind of heretic is Bruno Taut, who puts little bits of colour in various places and gives them this sort of slightly cutesy sort of doorway, for example. I can't now remember, there was a good... Corbusier has a suitably cutting remark which he makes about it, which I can't now remember. Anyway, one to look up. And... the whiteness, I think we should sort of contextualise where the whiteness is coming from, because it's very much, for me, I think it's obviously very much part of this rhetoric of an industrialised architecture for the machine age, deploying the technology and the capacity of industrialised mass production to solve social problems. This is something which lots of people are very exercised about. There is this idea of the existential minimum is a sort of a buzzword which is going around.
Which means the minimum you can live on. It's nothing like that makes it sound sort of complicated. It just means the minimum to sustain existence.
Yeah, what do you need, as in like what's necessary, what is a dwelling once you strip out all of the pretension.
Which is that's what Hannes Meyer's points were. What is the minimum? And it's like sex life, pets, automobile maintenance, domestic hygiene. I can't remember them all. Anyway.
Yeah, well, we should mention also Margarete Schutte-Lihotsky, who's the designer of the Frankfurt kitchen, which is this extremely sort of scientifically designed kitchen prototype from around this time.
Doing exactly the things that will be copied in America a few years later for sort of become kind of time and motion.
And it's all, it's all designed around minimizing how much you have to walk between different things being within easy reach of other things. It's all very scientific and kind of ergonomically driven.
It would become extremely fashionable in the 50s.
These like early, very functional objects, because of necessity, they're actually incredibly painstakingly crafted. So they have this real sort of strange beauty.
There are different strains going through. So, I mean, if I could talk about people who aren't Corb, we can analyse his a bit more depth. You've got people who are really more who really believe in functionalism. I think Oud believed in functionalism, and that the things should be stripped back, minimal, able to smash them out. And then you've got people like Mies, who really, he's still sort of he's really into English tailoring and polished watches, and sure, you look at like his later buildings and you think these are really mechanical, but really it's always about craft, and it's always about really elite. Even in here, all his staircases have got all this huge polished chromed, everything's shining and gleaming.
So I think that one of the real fault lines between the various members of this larger grouping, which is sort of very clear between people like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, who I think is on a bit of a journey, is to some extent how they view the architecture of the past, and certainly how they view architecture as a kind of a carrier for meaning. So is monumentality a dirty word for them. And one of the things which architects like Hannes Meyer will accuse Corbusier of, and we'll get into this more in future programmes, is of becoming monumental and therefore reactionary in the way in which he sort of arranges his forms. So for someone like Meyer, he doesn't feature, but he's very much like the sort of standard bearer for this extremely objective tendency. And I think we did mention his points, didn't we? This, he talks about the ruthless denial of the past. He talks about building as a technical and not an aesthetic process. Aesthetic composition does not rhyme with the function of a house matched to its purpose. So there's he kind of dreams of what is described almost as a sort of semi-nomadic existence, surrounded by these purely functional objects, none of which have this aesthetic character.
Hilberseimer's villa is a bit like that, and Ude's probably more on that side as well. Whereas Behrens belongs to the old orthodoxy. I mean, he got a big block. He was always trying to be... He said he was monumental, and he comes from a period when what they had to justify was that they were actually classical. That actually he was the heir of Schinkel, even though he didn't put ornament on things.
Yeah.
So he's kind of the generation before, when he's still in that mode of... There's that weird kind of... I think the last great wave of sincere classicism is the one that ends with the war, the First War, which is when it has become sublimated and archaic, and it's gone through stripping back to stripping to nothing almost. But anyway, after the First War, that's not the argument. The argument isn't, you're not classical, I'm the real classicist, you are a fake classicist. The argument is, we want to be rid of the past completely. This is year naught. The war has happened. The past is dreadful.
And Corbusier is much more ambivalent and much more flexible, isn't he? So in the things we were discussing in the last episode, there are all these sort of abstracted triumphal arches and things in there. And there's also, the city itself is like profoundly hierarchical, isn't it? It has like a formal and a social hierarchy which are mapped one onto the other.
He talks Meyer, but he walks Behrens completely. He doesn't even talk Meyer that hard. Really, actually, I would say intellectually he sort of agrees with functionalism, but as soon as you push him, really he's on the side of he's always banging on about like primitive man and stuff. That just really means classicism, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Timeless.
Yeah. Apollo. But like Apollo as some sort of vegetative god or whatever. Say at a more basic level, there's also in the scheme, there's people who try and make it as cheap as possible and still be functionalist, like Ude. There's people who spend the money on craft, a little bit of extra money, like Mies van der Rohe. And there's people who spend the money on fancy shapes, and that's Corb, Sharoon. Sharoon's much more fruity. Corb is really Swiss, dry. But he's still spending the money to have the building a certain sort of way through shape. The material palette's the same.
And I think of the two that he does one which is a little block of flats and one which is a double villa. The villa is definitely the one which you see more of, and it's this extremely horizontally expressed form. You've got a big picture of it in front of you. Do you want to describe it?
So the building, the land is sloping a little bit, and he deals with that by raising up. So the first thing to say is the building is long and thin, and I'm looking at the long and thin side which fronts onto the road. There's a bit of rock coming down on one side, and the whole thing is lifted up on a plinth, which takes up a shift in levels, which is probably 3 metres, maybe a little bit more, quite a bit. So that's a solid white concrete thing with the sort of rock plain and little trees. There's a huge loggia taking up basically the whole ground floor, but with a concrete wall behind it. And there's a row of steel columns taking up the side of that loggia, and that story is tall. On that, on the ground floor, there's essentially only the entrance and sort of lobby, which are recessed a long way back into this loggia. And then above that, there's another white layer of the cake with a strip of windows which runs essentially the whole width, except for the thicknesses of the walls at either end, and there's a little tiny break in the middle, which looks like it's 200mm wide or 150mm wide. The windows, The strip of windows is, there's a solid panel, there's a thin window, there's a square window, there's a solid panel, and it's like that all the way along. And they've got shutters, which fold back. And then above that, there's a roof terrace, which has got a low parapet wall. You see the steel columns have pierced right through the building and go right up and support a little roof on this over one part of terrace garden, which I think was officially the drying area for your clothes, which is something that all of them feature and was feature at the time. Didn't have dryers back then, and I think it was a massive pain in the neck, actually, if it was raining to dry your clothes. And so you have that basically framed rectangle. So it's a sort of series of rectangles on top of each other, and it's very long and thin. And the real impression is a box on thin sticks, with a black wall behind it. But it's really there's a huge plinth, there's a huge void, there's a box on sticks that you live in, and then there's a roof terrace on the top of that. And it's all very long and thin. And
this horizontal expression is like, it's very graphic. It's very, very defined. It's very striking.
Oh, and all the steel is painted black, and everything else is painted white. So it's really black and white.
Yeah, and as you say, so on the ground floor, in fact, there is a maid's room, which is a sort of curious feature of a lot of this workers' housing. And there is essentially all the living is on the first floor, and it's a layout which is a little bit like the house by the lake that he'd built for his mother. It's this quite flexible, separated by flexible partitions, quite open. The only totally enclosed room is the toilet and the kitchen, which are at one end, and then the bed and living spaces are sort of flexibly separable based on the bay, the kind of rhythm of the bays set up by the steel columns. And then there's a great big sun terrace, really, really big. The thing about the plan is that the circulation, there's this big rectangle, this big long rectangle, which is the main body of the house. But then there's a spur which juts out the back of it, which contains the stair, and then also has a little room which is hidden behind the stair.
It's funny. It's very cute.
Yeah, as a layout, it's full of these kind of ambiguous separations between spaces. Are a big feature.
Clarify thing, by the way, about the workers' housing. It's not all meant to be workers' housing. What it's meant to be is an ideal settlement, but they're not trying to get rid of class in it. This is a middle management house. So you've got the middle management houses and then the workers' houses somewhere else in the same estate, and you all go off to the factory together. His real obsession in this estate and Pessac is trying to not have people on the ground floor and have a roof garden, even when the building is surrounded by gardens. And both of these are superficially rather strange things to do. In the plan, he's worked quite carefully with a quite open plan to cut down on any wasted space and be very efficient. And then he's left 2 floors empty while squeezing the last 2% out of the main plan. It leads to quite an attractive result in some ways. And it's something that doesn't go away. I want to know what you think. Why is he doing these 2 things?
Yeah, I wonder when it starts.
It's not there in Domino.
No, it's not there in the Maison Domino. It's not there in the other houses.
It's starting in La Roche.
Yeah.
Which is quite early.
But it becomes a fixation. So it becomes something which he is absolutely wedded to in a lot of these villas in this period. And then in the later 20s, is something which he articulates and sort of post-rationalizes as a piece of ideology in the 5 points of architecture, which we're going to discuss when we talk about those late 20s villas in a future episode. It's connected to this primal metaphysical connection which he feels with the exterior and with the sun and with these essential forces of nature, which are, the way he understands life is as nourished by these primal essential forces, by the sun and by the earth. I think that it's easier to see where the sun terrace comes from, because the sun terrace, I mean, in the plans, it's literally referred to as a sun bath. Is what the sun terrace is, and it's this, in a way, as in La Roche, the terrace is one of the most private parts of the house. It's sort of like, it's like the sun bathroom that he was talking about in his demands in Towards the New Architecture. As to what's going on the ground floor, I think it's difficult not to feel that there is something a little sort of OCD going on here, like something a sort of imaginary kind of hygienism, taking things away from the wetness and softness of the earth and allowing that to be a kind of pure domain of nature and not either sullying or being sullied by this kind of compromised domesticity sitting on the ground, and everything sort of being hygienically lifted up into the air and away from that, where it can be entirely its own domain, neither of the air nor of the earth.
It's a really strong desire he has. I wondered if it's sort of the same thing as like the Piano Nobile. It's like the first floor is brighter, and it's where you put the really big windows, and the posh people live because it's the nicest floor. And the ground floor is a bit dank and dark, as you say, and you put servants and garages and nothing in there.
There are good pragmatic reasons for doing it, but
there aren't, in the sense of it doesn't make sense to lift your villa 1 story off the ground when it's 1 story tall.
No.
And it is a problem, actually, because the spaces underneath these are always kind of rat crap.
Because the garden doesn't go under the house because the plants don't have any light and they die. Maybe you could grow some like rubber plants under there or something.
Yeah, but it's also cold and miserable.
Yeah. No, it doesn't work. You can park cars under there.
But he normally says you shouldn't.
It doesn't work as a space. Does the sun terrace work as a space? Well, sort of it does and doesn't for different reasons. I mean, the failures there are mostly technical, aren't they? These are quite sort of technically difficult to execute well. The flat roof with a terrace on top of it. They tend to leak.
Sure, I would also say there's some design problems with them. I don't think you need as much terrace as you need living space. I love a terrace. I think they're really nice to have. But you don't need as much as you need everything else put together.
No. So in the Weissenhofseidlung, certainly in the houses, the terrace is the size of... It's larger than 2 bedrooms put together, plus... It's essentially the size of the living room and all of the bedrooms, I think, in pure square metre terms, for a sun bath.
In a house with a garden.
Because you really only need space for a couple of chairs and a table.
Taut does them. Taut gives all his people little balcony things, and they are big enough for 3 people to eat dinner on comfortably just.
I think that's a good size, isn't it? I mean, there's been a recent sort of move. There's been a bit of a demand for bigger balconies in flats in London.
Yeah, but that's because before they weren't big enough to have a chair on them.
Yeah, no, it's like maybe 900 by 1.2 metres or something. It's like a nice size.
I think it should be... it's quite nice to have them 2 metres deep.
Yeah.
Or like 1.8. It's quite nice to be able to have like a 600 table. And then, like, that's a really nice thing.
But in this one, you could have dinner for 30 people quite comfortably.
Yeah, and a ping pong table. And you could have your rotting old settee up there, and no amount of white goods would make an appreciable dent.
Yeah. Oh no, your whole laundrette with no trouble at all. I think that it's something which we also saw in the city plans, is that he gets obsessions, he gets things which he believes in, and then he will...
7 floors, 7 layers of transport.
Yeah, but that's it, isn't it? He has an idea, he thinks, wouldn't it be nice? But then he doesn't explore it by doing a bit of it. He proposes the furthest possible, vastly excessive response to this demand which he has. So he doesn't say, oh, well, everyone's going to have a nice little sun terrace and, maybe it'll be the size of a bedroom or something. It's the single biggest space in the house.
And it's worth re-emphasising that other people were doing this and they were making it a sensible size. Lots of people included in this, lots of these avant-garde included things that were sort of lovely, but very moderate. Like, it's quite a common thing to have what they call, rather optimistically, a winter garden, which means that you have 600 mil between the outer set of windows and the inner set of windows in which it's imagined you'll grow tropical plants. And it's not a standard feature of social housing in the UK, but it's rather nice.
Yeah, it's a nice
but
idea.
It's quite achievable as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, they often have sun balconies, which are big enough to eat on, but what do you get with all of this extra balcony? What you get is the ability to not have anything else on the top floor.
There's a tiny little room behind the stairwell, which is marked down as being a library on this plan.
Yeah, which really feels like a chair. There's a sort of 80s criticism that no one ever goes on the roof terrace. It's not true. It's just that how can you possibly fill a roof terrace that's that big?
If you made it just a tiny bit bigger, you could have a good old game of football up there, couldn't you? But it's just...
Yeah, if you don't mind occasionally Jimmy running off the edge. One of the sides, I think the parapet is 500 on one edge.
That'll be character building, won't it?
One of those heights where you may or may not die. Parquet was not well established at this point, was it? In the Villa La Roche, one of the standard things is you have a parapet lip up to 300 and then one bar at just over a metre. And that's the prevention of falling strategy. They've had to retroactively install some sort of mesh.
Shame.
It probably is, yeah. Anyway, his buildings, I think the Sharoon ones are really fun. Lots of them have nice detailing. Some of them are really stark, and that's quite attractive.
A lot of them are. Some of them.
The oud ones are really stark. The little oud terrace.
A lot of them wear their kind of utilitarianism as, pretty kind of heavily. Their inelegance is quite a big part of what they're projecting. It's like quite lumpen.
I think Corbs are the most beautiful, the most like crisply, tastefully judged. Some of the others, I think Sharoon's is fun, and the Mies always will have the most beautiful details because it's just what he's into.
It's his obsession, yeah. Yeah.
I think it's really important what we said at the beginning. There's like functionalists, and then there's these people who really they talk the language, but really they're not about functionalism. Corb isn't really about functionalism. He's about monumentality. Meyer was right.
Yeah. They look a bit curious as a housing prototype because what they really look like is a sort of astonishing villa for someone very wealthy or something, don't they? It's like this amazing, stark, volumetric form in a landscape.
It's strongly my suspicion that what gives it a lot of its visual power is its difference to the humdrum stuff you see about you. I had an idea a long time ago that Stonehenge is looked at completely the wrong way, that it must have been that it was so unnatural and so artificial. That must have been why they made it like that. It's like utterly unlike anything natural. It's completely synthetic because the world around them was so different to that. And these are really unlike the cityscape of the time. They're really unlike the cityscape now, but they're really, really unlike the cityscape of the time. He's got rid of windows as they knew them then, little rectangles. All the decoration. It's stark by comparison to modern. But would it be if the whole city was like that? Or would it just be humdrum? And if you're spending all this effort and energy on making something, like part of what gives it its monumental character is that it's also unlike what you see. And it's very well judged as well. Like, I'm not saying that you would ever have people churning these out because he's a master of it. He's really good at his rectangle arranging. The void of the top where you look over the parapet between the roof is the same as the windows. Yeah. Having the beam go through the top, right through the building, piercing it like a stick, is a sort of virtuoso move. The whole thing is virtuoso. He's so good at it. It's like Zumta, but with a different... It's all about this extremely impractical and aesthetic ideal.
Yes, and it works so well because there aren't any more of them.
And because he's brilliant at it.
Yeah.
Like, there's no doubting that he's also brilliant at it.
Okay, so we've got to say something to end it. So, well, I guess the thing to say is that this focus on mass housing is something which goes on developing into the 30s, and which then also really has a very distinct identity after the war as well. So that in a sense, maybe there's at least 3 distinct ages of this in Corb's career. And what we're talking about here is the first one where it maintains an extremely close connection to the villas. And you can see that the ideas which are being worked on in the villas are also being explored, blown up in different ways in the mass housing. Something which is definitely happens in the later eras is that as a building type, it starts to take on its own identity a lot more, and that the preoccupations of those larger scales of buildings become quite specific to them and different from the things which he's exploring in the smaller commissions.
His attempts to actually build volume housing, he doesn't address the practical elements of building mass housing. His mass housing is actually really in the language of villas, but chopped up smaller. It's the same material world, slightly toned down, and the budgets accordingly. I'm not sure he, at this point, has yet challenged what his idea of the tower or the big building is going to be. The big building isn't a 5 points type building. It's not a white rendered block with strip windows. He does experiment with that, but when he finds a formula for it,
which he will start to do in the 30s.
Which he will start to do pretty soon, but will go through various stages and really is 10 years behind his thinking on villas because he's been able to get villa projects.
Yeah.
His intellectual focus has been essentially on villa and villa-like things. Over the next period, he will begin to have some more substantial ideas about big buildings. We have the cruciform skyscraper, but it's so obviously not worked out.
That's not it, is it?
And he will develop ideas about slabs and points, but they haven't happened yet. We have this whole world which really is domino, which turns out to really to be a luxury mode. In the Garden of Savoie, he built an existential minimum house.
For
the only one.
For the servants.
For the gardener. And the existential minimum house is tiny. It's a house supposedly for a family. It has 1.5 rooms. The interior, I would say, is 1.5 times the size of the room we're in now. But it's still raised on pilotis, has a sun terrace, I think.
He's still on there.
He's absolutely addicted to this thinking which comes from luxury villas. At a time when loads of avant-garde architects who he was corresponding with, who knew well, were promoting real practical views of volume housing. He will, later on in his career, get nearer, but he's always going to be not a functionalist. He's always a perfectionist.
And he can't really, fundamentally, for someone like Hans Meyer, if you read his writing, he sort of delights in trying to desacralize and to what life is and what life is about. And Corbusier can never do that. It always has this romantic quality. He can never de-romanticize the essential stuff of the relationship of people to their lives, to the world which surrounds them, to the sun. He can't escape. And I think, all the better for it, really. But he can never stop seeing the sun as this kind of wonderful, benevolent god.
If what it is to be a man is to be the vertical underneath a cosmic sky, making the T-square against the horizon, there's no point in having anything less than a monumental house.
Okay, well, that was the episode. Thanks. If you're a new listener, hello.
Hello. I think we must have had some new listeners having scared everyone off with doing 7 episodes
we
of Corb.
We won't always talk about Corb. We've got some other stuff coming up.
I'm getting pretty sick of him, actually. He's
But at the same time, it's I'm loving what we're discovering, and the more I learn, the more... we made this kind of bold statement when we started talking about him that he was one of the 2 most important architects of all time or something like that.
I think he's the most influential architect of all time.
I
still stand by that.
Honestly, the more time you spend with him, the more you discover he connects to every significant discovery of certainly of his era and subsequent eras. he's a one step away from everything important that has happened in architecture, basically.
And he does so many different things. There are other architects who do tons of buildings, but he does so many different things. This is one.
Yeah. Thank you very much for listening. We're up on the Instagram, and I'm doing my best to sort of. We've got lots of good illustrations from various places, and we'll keep putting them up. I know it helps to see some of these things that we're talking about. But yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.